there's a quiet shame that follows every failed attempt at change. You make promises to yourself to wake earlier, to eat cleaner, to work harder, and each time you fall short, it feels like proof that something inside you is broken. You call it lack of discipline. You call it laziness, weakness, inconsistency. But if you look closely, beneath all those labels, you'll find something more tender. The simple truth that the self you're trying to be still feels foreign. You're not failing because you lack control. You're failing because you're trying to behave like someone you don't yet believe you are. We treat discipline as the cure for disconnection, as though forcing ourselves hard enough can make us belong to the version of ourselves we dream of becoming. But Jung would have said the problem is not effort. The problem is identity. When your conscious mind builds a plan that your unconscious does not recognize, the psyche revolts. It resists, not to sabotage you, but to protect you. Because every pattern of behavior, even the ones you hate, once served to keep you safe. You can't just tear those patterns away. You have to understand who they were built to protect. If this feels familiar, stay with me. The person who procrastinates often isn't lazy. They're protecting themselves from exposure. To act means to be seen, to be evaluated, to risk inadequacy. The procrastinator delays not because they don't care, but because they care too much. And the inner critic they fear is not out there in the world. It's internalized from years of trying to earn worth. Jung called this the complex, the cluster of memories, emotions, and meanings around an old wound. When you try to change behavior without healing the complex underneath, your own psyche drags you back to safety, even if that safety hurts. You say you want discipline, but discipline without identity is violence. You're asking yourself to fight the part of you that still believes it's unworthy of change. The body resists that command because it remembers what it's like to be punished for imperfection. So every time you fail, it confirms an old story, that you can't trust yourself. That's not lack of willpower. That's loyalty. Loyalty to the person you once had to be to survive. Real transformation, Jung would say, begins when you stop trying to control the symptom and start listening to it. The symptom, the procrastination, the avoidance, the inconsistency, is a message from the unconscious. It's saying, something in me doesn't feel safe becoming this new person. Until you translate that message, your actions will always return to what your identity allows. Identity is not what you say you are. It's what your nervous system believes you are safe being. You can declare, I am disciplined, but if your deeper self still associates discipline with pressure, criticism, or shame, the body won't follow. It will delay. It will distract. It will dissolve your efforts to protect you from what it perceives as danger. And here's the quiet truth. You cannot become disciplined by force. You become disciplined when the version of you that resists finally feels seen. When the part of you that's afraid of change is met with understanding instead of judgment. That's when your unconscious stops fighting and starts helping. Because now, you're not trying to become someone else. You're trying to become whole. Jung taught that what we repress doesn't disappear. It becomes shadow. And every time you try to fix yourself without integrating your shadow, you strengthen it. The harder you push, the louder it protests. So the path forward isn't domination, it's dialogue. You ask your resistance, what are you trying to protect me from? You might be surprised by the answer. Maybe your resistance says, if you become successful, people will expect more of you. Maybe it says, if you change, you'll outgrow the people who once made you feel loved. Or maybe it says, last time you tried, you were humiliated. I don't want you to feel that again. When you listen with compassion, resistance softens, because the psyche no longer needs to scream when it's finally being heard. To change your identity is not to erase your past, it's to include it, to build a new self that doesn't reject who you were, but honors why that self existed. That's what Jung meant when he said, I would rather be whole than good. Discipline is about goodness, about control, perfection, performance. Wholeness is about truth, about integration, acceptance, aliveness. The disciplined person says, I must do this. The integrated person says, this is who I am. One fights the self. The other evolves it. The shift happens quietly. You stop trying to force new habits and start embodying new meanings. You no longer wake up early because you should. You wake up early because it feels natural for someone who values peace. You no longer eat healthy because you must. You eat healthy because you've become the kind of person who honors their energy. Discipline dissolves into identity. Effort becomes expression. And that's the irony. The more you focus on discipline, the more fragile it becomes. Because discipline depends on willpower, a finite resource that tires. Identity, however, runs on belief. And belief is self-reinforcing. When you act from who you believe you are, every action strengthens that identity. When you act against it, every action drains it. You don't fail because you lack strength. You fail because you're loyal to an old definition of yourself. Every failure is really your psyche saying, I still identify with who I used to be. And identity never changes through shame. It changes through safety. So the first step is not, how do I do this? It's, who do I need to feel safe being to do this? And often the answer is someone who no longer equates effort with pain. Someone who no longer confuses stillness with weakness. Someone who allows themselves to want without fear of disappointment. You don't need discipline to change. You need permission to be someone new. And that permission doesn't come from achievement. It comes from intimacy, the quiet understanding between your conscious and unconscious selves that you no longer need to hide from each other. The moment you stop forcing yourself to evolve and start listening to the parts that resist, a subtle peace appears. Not because you've achieved control, but because you've found coherence. Your actions and your identity begin to speak the same language. That's when the real transformation begins. When effort no longer feels like a fight, and every small act of growth feels like remembering who you were always meant to be. Because, in truth, discipline is a bridge, but identity is the destination. And maybe that's why Jung warned that most people don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Discipline tries to force light. Identity learns to befriend the dark. And in that friendship, something ancient shifts. The will stops trembling. The inner war softens. You no longer chase change. You allow it. And that's when the old self begins to fade, quietly, like a season ending. There's a strange grief in letting go of who you used to be. Not because that version was perfect, but because it was familiar. It's the self that carried you through years of confusion, the self that built defenses when no one else protected you. Even if that identity was rooted in fear, it was still yours, and the psyche mourns what it outgrows. That's why real change often feels heavy, even when it's good. You're not just forming a new habit, you're burying an old self. When Jung wrote about individuation, he wasn't talking about self-improvement. He was describing reconciliation, the lifelong process of uniting what you show the world with what you hide from it. Most people mistake discipline for this journey. They think if they can just control enough, they'll finally be themselves. But control isolates. You can't connect to your wholeness by repressing the parts you fear. You can't meet your soul through a checklist. Every act of force separates you further from your center. Because control is a language the unconscious doesn't understand. It speaks in symbols, not schedules, in images, not demands. So when you try to dominate yourself into alignment, you create tension instead of trust. And that tension leaks out as fatigue, guilt, and quiet resentment. Have you ever noticed how the harder you push yourself, the more fragile your motivation becomes? It's because pressure doesn't produce freedom. It produces compliance. And compliance is temporary. Once the external or internal threat fades, so does the behavior. But when behavior rises from identity, from self-recognition, it sustains itself. You don't have to remember to be who you are. The unconscious is always shaping you. If it believes you're unworthy, it will create experiences that confirm it. If it believes you're capable, it will open pathways you once thought impossible. You don't attract what you want. You express what you believe. That's why people repeat the same patterns with different faces, different jobs, different goals. The outer world keeps rearranging, but the inner script stays the same. So when Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate," he was describing this invisible law. You call it bad luck or lack of willpower, but it's really self-concept looping. Until you rewrite the identity beneath the behavior, the story repeats, not as punishment, but as a gentle insistence. See me. Integrate me. Integration isn't about deleting what's dark. It's about discovering what the darkness protects. The perfectionist, for instance, often guards a child who was only loved when they excelled. The overachiever hides someone terrified of being invisible. The chronic self-saboteur shelters a part that believes peace is unsafe because peace once meant vulnerability. These identities are not random. They are coded survival responses. And you can't discipline survival out of yourself. You can only love it into safety. The moment you stop punishing these parts and start including them, they transform. Fear turns into awareness. Resistance turns into intuition. Because the energy that once fueled defense now fuels expression. And the behaviors you use to fight against, procrastination, distraction, self-doubt, become signals instead of enemies. Notice how each carries a message. Procrastination whispers, "I'm scared of being judged." Distraction murmurs, "I don't feel connected to what I'm doing." Self-doubt says, "I haven't yet built the identity that can hold this version of success." When you listen deeply, you realize these aren't flaws to fix, but languages to decode. Your psyche is not your opponent. It's your oldest ally, trying to get your attention. Change, then, becomes less about effort and more about translation. You start asking, what does this feeling need in order to relax? And when it relaxes, you naturally behave differently, not because you forced yourself to, but because your system no longer needs protection. Discipline says, push harder. Identity says, understand deeper. And the deeper you understand, the more naturally you act in alignment. But here's what few people tell you. Becoming a new identity often means losing the rewards of the old one. When you stop being the rescuer, people may stop depending on you. When you stop being the victim, sympathy fades. When you stop being the achiever, validation quiets. And without those external affirmations, you might feel naked, unanchored. This is the in-between, the sacred confusion before rebirth. It's the moment when your new identity hasn't fully formed, but the old one no longer fits. You'll feel exposed, uncertain, sometimes even lost. But this space is essential. It's where the psyche rewires. Because identity isn't built through clarity alone. It's built through surrender. Through allowing yourself to not know who you are long enough for something truer to emerge. Most people try to escape this liminal phase. They rush back to old roles just to feel solid again. But the soul evolves in ambiguity. Growth rarely feels like progress. It feels like dissolution. Jung called this the Thynksee journey, the passage through darkness where the ego dies a little, so the self can be born. You won't find motivation here. You'll find silence. And it's in that silence that the new identity starts to whisper. It doesn't arrive with fanfare or grand realization. It arrives through small choices that feel peaceful instead of forced, through actions that no longer demand energy to maintain, because they simply fit. You start noticing that you don't need to remind yourself to rest. You just rest. You don't need to motivate yourself to create. You just create. Because identity doesn't require discipline to sustain itself. It's self-sustaining. And slowly, the grief of losing your old self transforms into gratitude. You realize that the person you were wasn't wrong. They were a foundation. They built the safety from which this new self could rise. Their mistakes weren't failures. They were instructions. It's strange. The moment you stop rejecting who you were is the moment you become who you're meant to be. Because your old self stops fighting your growth once it's seen as part of your wholeness. The psyche finally exhales. There's no longer a war between who I am and who I should be. There's only movement, fluid, grounded, alive. That's why transformation doesn't feel like conquest. It feels like remembering, as if some ancient part of you finally opens its eyes and says, "Ah, there you are." And in that reunion, the concept of discipline feels almost childish, like using a ladder to reach what's already within your grasp. You realize you were never meant to climb to your best self. You were meant to remove what blocks you from remembering it. Still, the mind resists simplicity. It asks, if identity is everything, then how do I change mine? And the answer, paradoxically, is that you already are. Every act of awareness alters identity. Every moment you choose understanding over judgment, you rewire what you believe about yourself. You are not trying to become someone else. You are updating the truth of who you already are. Change doesn't begin with a declaration. It begins with a quiet noticing. I don't resonate with this anymore. That noticing is the seed of new identity. It's how the unconscious signals readiness. You don't force it open. You nurture it with presence. And then, one morning, without fanfare, you wake up and realize you no longer need to convince yourself to show up for your life. You're already in it. But this is not the end of the journey. It's merely the soft threshold of something deeper, a mystery waiting just beyond the edge of this newfound peace. There's a quiet moment when striving dissolves, and what's left is you, unguarded, listening. You begin to sense that discipline was never the point. It was a bridge to trust. All along, your effort was guiding you toward something gentler, the feeling of being safe inside your own rhythm. You move slower now, but each movement feels true. You no longer chase direction. You follow resonance. Every action that once required pressure now unfolds on its own, as if some deeper current has taken over. There's no finish line here, only noticing. Noticing how peace feels like strength, how silence starts to speak, how your old patterns don't vanish. They soften, waiting to be understood. Maybe discipline was just the language you needed until self-trust could form words. Maybe this is what Jung meant by becoming whole, not a final version of yourself, but an ongoing conversation between what is known and what is still becoming. And as you listen to that conversation, something quiet begins to bloom. Not control, not certainty, just an inner yes, echoing softly, somewhere beneath your skin.